right, Donovan, ready? Let's go. Welcome to Northwood's House. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. It is a new year, and we thought that this would be a perfect opportunity to host you here at our beautiful offices and to share with you some very interesting and exciting policy insights that we at the Free Market Foundation have been busy developing since Q3 of 2024 in the wake of the formation of the Government of National Unity, the GNU. And it is called Liberty First. And it is a blueprint for freedom, because freedom is our highest political value as a classical liberal organization. And what you would have received when you arrived here today is a very short précis, which lists the various policy recommendations that we at the Free Market Foundation are putting forward to policy makers, to politicians, members of civil society, but most importantly, ordinary individuals such as you and I who live and want to prosper and be free here in South Africa. So there have been some big political changes, and we'll speak about some of those, but just a bit of background context as to the structure and the methodology that we pursued. We have a very strong relationship with the Fraser Institute in Canada, which is a free market think tank. They produce the Economic Freedom of the World annual report, which ranks countries around the world based on their economic freedom score. And there are 5 categories in which the EFW is structured, and they are freedom to trade internationally, size of government, regulation, legal system and property rights, and sound money. So those 5 key areas, we produced a short report, which I'd invite you to go and read for yourself. On each of these areas, every week we had a new launch of these papers. So we were burning the midnight oil here at the FMF, putting forward our ideas. And we have, for your benefit, consolidated all of these reports into a master report, the Blueprint for Freedom. What you have with you is the abridged version, which lists all of the policy prescriptions, all of our proposals. But if you want to see the substance, the motivation behind these proposals, I would encourage you to check out that report, over 100 pages long, so some bedside reading for you. All right, so the format for tonight is going to be very informal. My name is David Ansara. I will be facilitating this discussion. We're delighted to be joined by our live stream audience as well on YouTube and other social media platforms. I'll be joined as well by Dr. Morne Malan, who's the Deputy Head of Policy here at the FMF. To his right is Zakhele Ntembu, who's a Policy Officer. And then last but not least, we have Martin van Staden, who's the Head of Policy here at the FMF. So we've convened the policy team. Morne and Martin each wrote 2 of the reports. I wrote the 5th and final one on sound money, and Zakhele played a supporting role, released a lot of excellent videos on our YouTube channel, short explainers, which I'd encourage you to go and watch. But what we'll do is we'll have a general policy discussion as the panel for about 40 minutes or so, and then for the last 20 minutes, we'll hand over to you, our live audience, for Q&A. So if you have any burning questions, do save those to the end if you don't mind. We'll be having a roaming mic as well, so if you need to use that, that's for the benefit of our viewers back home. So we would actually encourage you to use that. And then afterwards, we'll invite you for some drinks and snacks. But without further ado, let's commence with the conversation. All right, so I opened the remarks here. Martin, I'll start with you. Just by reflecting on the rather dramatic events of May 29th, 2024, and the subsequent negotiations for the formation of the GNU, we were quite quick out of the blocks with some of these policy prescriptions, which we then delved into in more detail. And, what was the initial motivation here? And I'd like to also just reflect on what we've seen over the last 6 months. And from our perspective, what I think we are seeing is a lot of status quo bias that has continued from the previous ANC hegemonic era. What are some of your reflections generally on the GNU?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, this is a new thing that happened in South Africa. We are coming out of 3 decades of ANC monopolizing the democratic situation in South Africa, and now for the first time, the ANC has fallen below 50% to about 40, and that led to, I must say, maybe over our objections to the formation of this multi-party coalition government. We would have preferred something called confidence and supply, and various preconditions maybe associated with multi-party government. That didn't happen, but still, this was a change in how policy kind of discourse in South Africa works. And in recognition of that, we decided, listen, let's take the proven examples of what produces flourishing around the world. That is the Economic Freedom of the World Index. The one thing I always put to my friends on the left on social media and in debates is show us one country that has high levels of economic freedom that is also poor. And I've never, up to now, been given an answer of a free capitalist country that is somehow finds itself in the midst of total destitution. It doesn't exist. So as far as we're concerned, the Fraser Institute really has put in place a mechanism that shows us what policies you should put in place if you want prosperity and flourishing in society. And we turned that framework into discrete, concrete policy proposals in each of our 5 areas. And we showed this to the government, to policymakers, and said, listen, if you want to, if the value proposition that we're being told, and we are being told this, is that it's a bright new day in South Africa and we're going to change. And now the next 5 years, this parliamentary term is going to be one of reinvigoration, one of growth, and one of prosperity. This is really the only way that you can do it. And the door definitely was left ajar for that after the election. No longer can the ANC just unilaterally impose its views. At least there has to be some kind of debate. That's the theory. Now we are in January of 2025, and I think as far as, let me speak for myself, as far as I'm concerned, the months after the formation of the GNU have been relatively, on a policy front, have been more of the same. Let's put it like that. There have been improvements in efficiency, certainly, and that's notable. It's important. But as far as fundamental policy reform, the things that you need to break the 13 million strong unemployed workforce, army of unemployed in South Africa, the things that you need to get to 2 or 3 and 4 or 5% growth, those policy reforms have not happened. And there's a saying in politics that your first 100 days in a new government are the times where it's the time when you have the most political capital for real change. That ended in October of last year. The 100 days are over. So now I think South Africa maybe generally is coming around to the fact that the GNU is the new normal and it's now business as usual, really. And I think that's a problem. I think it's not just a policy problem for the economy, for society, but it's also, I think, going to be a problem for the parties in the GNU come 2029, maybe even 2026. So I think, yeah, that's notable. But still, the FMF is going to be pushing these policy reforms. These are imminently doable things. We didn't propose anything unconstitutional, so no need to worry about that. Though all that's necessary is political will. And some of these really are low-hanging fruit, like increasing the threshold for litigation in the High Court and kind of the threshold for litigating in the Small Claims Court and abolishing the post office's monopoly on parcels. These are easy things. You don't have to change your NDR ideology or whatever to make these things happen. So actually there's a wide variety of things that can be done to improve South Africa's situation, and it's not happening. So let's maybe let me leave it there.
Yeah, okay. I think there's some interesting themes that we'll unpack a bit further throughout this conversation. So maybe Mornay, let me turn to you now. You were the author of the regulation paper. Martin authored the size of government paper. And I think on both of those measures, the GNU has disappointed. So on size of government, we now have a very bloated cabinet. About, what is the number now? 73, including deputy ministers. Some portfolios have more than one deputy minister. For context, we put out a press release saying, well, you should actually be scrapping the number of ministers, the superfluous ones, and reducing the size of cabinet down to 10 portfolios, which is even more than what Norway currently has, which I believe only has about 9 cabinet ministers. I think Switzerland is similar. So GNU is actually big government writ large. And then maybe we can also discuss the regulatory side of things as well. But maybe you have some reflections on that, Morne Milan.
Yes. Sorry. Yes, definitely disappointed on both accounts, although disappointed in different ways. When it comes to the size of government, certainly, cabinet has grown. I'd be quite surprised if our president could even name the entire cabinet offhand. Yeah, I think it's over 70 members if you include deputy ministers and so forth. So definitely a larger cabinet, and that was almost inevitable when it comes to the way in which the GNU was structured. There were just too many people, too many politically interested people who had to be accommodated in some way. And that accommodation has taken the form of specific positions in specific areas of the cabinet. So I think when it comes to the size of the cabinet, and unfortunately when it also comes to the size of government generally, because obviously it's not just a minister, there's an entire political apparatus that also has to be created when you create a new ministry or when you create a new position in cabinet. So government has grown in size. I think what we always tend to differentiate is not only the size of government, which is important. It's definitely important because that impacts the amount of revenue that government has to extract in order to fund all of the various things it wants to do and to fund all of the people who work in government. Yeah, which means taxes, basically. So that means more taxes. So bigger government means more taxes. So it is important, but I think even more important than that is the scope of government. And that usually takes the form of regulation. So it's not just the absolute number of politicians, number of state actors, it's also the amount of impact that they have on economic activity. So, I mean, you could have a cabinet of 100 people. If those 100 people don't necessarily interfere as much in the economy, then, you know, it's not going to have as big an impact. So, yes, when it comes to regulation, and unfortunately we have not seen much in terms of a rolling back of regulations, but we also haven't seen much in terms of a proliferation of regulation. So whereas pre-GNU, we did have this leftward drift in terms of policy, I do think that post-GNU, it's not so much that we've continued moving in the same direction, it's more so that everything's almost halted. It's almost as though nobody's quite sure what they're allowed to do, what they should be doing. It's almost as though everybody sort of has to figure out where they fit in the larger coalition. And I think that was also one of the motivations for the paper was William Buckley has this quote where he says that if you expect your people to know on which side of the line they're supposed to stand, you have to actually draw a line in the sand and say, this is where we stand, this is what we expect, and if you're not on this side of the line, you're on the wrong side of the line. And that's actually a lot of the motivation was to clearly define, here are very workable, very practical measures, which if you find yourself on the wrong side of, then we are rightly disappointed in your performance in the GNU.
So Zakhele and Tembu, let's turn to you now. So you hail from KwaZulu-Natal, and really the events in KwaZulu-Natal shaped the national agenda quite considerably, because we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for a certain former president of the Republic who started a new political party in, was it December 2023, and then stormed into third place. So you just returned from a trip to KZN. What was your sense, the mood on the ground? What is the attitude there towards the GNU, and then also the provincial level, the GPU, where there's a multi-party coalition in power in KZN?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, no, the people in KZN are, as you said, very important people. Would like to think of ourselves as important, you know. We decide the fate of the entire country. So yeah, but as regarding the general feeling, right? The GNU, the people in KZN, of course, majority voted for, you know, MK, and even in my family, I have family members who are staunch Mr. Zuma supporters, and they remain steadfast in that support, right? But I think in the circles I'm around here in Joburg, right, people are disappointed in the GNU because I'm a libertarian. So I talk to a lot of liberally minded people. Their disappointment at GNU is because they think it is not reforming enough. Whereas in KZN, they are, I wouldn't say happy with the GNU. They are, of course, unhappy with it, primarily because they see it as a betrayal of, the ideals which the ANC used to stand for. By with them working with the DA and like the Freedom Fund Plus, they are quite opposed to that. But they're also quite hopeful because, well, as you saw in last year's election, MK grew. And not only did MK grow in the province, it also grew nationally. So to them, they are looking at the next elections as we finally have a vehicle that can speak to our needs, speak to what we want the world and our country to look like. And to them, it is quite the exciting time, right? So MK is busy building structures in KZN, rural KZN, and most townships, and yeah, people are really just fully bought into the idea of MK, not necessarily the idea of the GNU. Instead, the politically savvy among even my family members who are spoken to are happy that the GNU is happening because they think that it will result in a departure of much more people from the ANC joining the ranks of MK due to what we've spoken about here. At least Monet has touched on that. Nothing seems to be happening, even though they want the country to move in a much more leftist direction in most cases than not. And we are, of course, proponents of freedom. So in their instance, the GNU delays the movement of the country towards a much more leftist position, whereas we think, of course, it should be moving much more freer. So yeah, the mood is, they're unhappy with the GNU, but they're also pretty hopeful that in the future it will result in, a shift to the left because the ANC is no longer a viable vehicle for the ideals they believe in.
I don't want to spend the entire panel discussion debating whether or not people should be in the GNU or not. But Martin, I saw you reacting to some earlier comments there. I mean, ultimately, for the junior participants in the GNU, if they're going to be part of this grand project, they need to get something out of it. And what that looks like is serving the interests of their constituents. And, where are the major policy victories that we were expecting coming out of the GNU? I think that they're few and far between.
Yeah, I think you're too optimistic, David. Few is a big word. Yeah, so I mean, the Free Market Foundation and certainly myself in my column on the Daily Friend for many years was keen on confidence and supply arrangement, whereby the ANC is a minority government and they receive parliamentary support for budgets and confidence votes. That didn't happen. So the next most important thing that, in our view, had to happen was that there had to be certain preconditions. It couldn't have simply been a lifeline to the ANC from the DA, the Freedom Front, from the PA, etc. There had to be certain concessions that had to be given upfront and immediately to make it worthwhile. And I don't think we asked for terribly much. I mean, we as liberals and libertarians, we could ask to privatize all the roads and all the police services, and all these things are perfectly comfortable within our ideological framework, but no, we didn't go there. We said that there should be devolution of policing functions, of transportation infrastructure, Transnet. NHI certainly, of course, had to be abandoned. This is not entrenched like the NHS in the UK. This was a new policy proposal. So I was saying abandon that, shouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility. That should have been a precondition. I think we said the post office there had to be some, I think we said privatize it. It's dead anyway, so might as well, or liquidate it or something. So it's not like we went full hog with the types of things that would have been given full expression to what we would say is liberal values, but there had to be something that indicates that the GNU is a partnership. It's not just someone coming to keep the ANC in government, which it ended up being because there were no preconditions. We were told after the GNU was formed that the one big so-called concession was this idea of sufficient consensus. Now, I see in the audience some people might remember that there was such an idea in the first GNU before, and it turned out exactly the same way. So a sufficient consensus in the 1990s was that, hey, if the cabinet broadly agrees, then we'll adopt a new policy. Obviously, the ANC was much bigger then than it was now, so this sufficient consensus requirement should have meant a lot more, especially given that the ANC lost the election. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. So we see the Department of Trade and Industry just this week proposed a transformation fund. Now, if you had to, this thing is 100 billion rand, it represents a new 3% tax on the private sector to support financial grants to black businesses and so forth. So it's kind of more of the same, but it's a new policy. Now, if we have to take the sufficient consensus requirement on its face, the biggest parties in the GNU had to agree to this before it could have been floated. I think the DA has complained that the minister has acted unilaterally and so forth. And sure, cool. But if this can happen, and if this is allowed to happen, just like every bad policy decision since the last election has been allowed to happen, signing the Bella Bill into law, the mission to devolve to the Western Cape provincial government on policing, something that was floated at the time. If these things do not happen, then this idea of having a red line, of having this concession, starts becoming a bit murkier. And then we're left with, well, what actually is the thing that we are being given? I don't want to belabor the carry on this, but of course the idea is that it's an alternative to an EFF-MK government, and this is kind of the least evil situation. And I think there's merit in that view. I think at the time I also said that, then just tell us that you're willing to concede everything, just until the point of having those other parties come into government. Fair enough. But currently that's not the case. We are being told that we're changing things, we're turning things around. And I mean, what Zake said here was important, and I think MK has reason to be jovial, because nothing is happening that is going to break the back of unemployment in South Africa. Nothing is happening that's going to do that. Nothing really is happening that is going to turn South Africa into a construction yard. It's simply not happening, and that means that the only ones who can profit from that in 2029 will be the radicals. So yeah, I'm quite cynical on whether the parties in the GNU have in fact delivered for their constituents what was promised, which is very much a Save South Africa message.
So Zach, so the question in politics is always compared to what? So some people might respond to Martin and say, well, you know, the alternative is far worse. You've got MK and EFF waiting in the wings, ready to impose their radical policy agenda. What do you think?
I would agree with those people. I think like we're with idealism, right? And I'm the most idealistic person you'll find. I am an anarchist, believes that the state should not exist. But I am also quite very aware, maybe it's because I'm surrounded by people who believe in ideas that I find reprehensible, right? My family members, as I've said, like these are people
Hopefully
who are,
not us.
No.
Okay.
Outside of the menarchists, but yeah. But either way, right? So I have learned at the very least to appreciate the thrust of reality. And I think that's what Martin loses when he speaks about, you know, the failures of the GNU, is that we should look at what would happen if the GNU wasn't there, right? Now nothing is happening. Granted, that is not good for us who wants the world to be much more freer. And that is also not good for the radicals. We should remember too, that is also not good for the radicals. It means that their plans just get delayed. And I think we lose this appreciation that things can get worse. They can. And the GNU, without it, things would have gotten worse. Things, even though the GNU did not deliver all of these points that we'll be talking about right now, like, right, as Martin mentioned, unemployment. I've written extensively about unemployment. I want the repeal, ideally, of the BCEA and the LRA, but without that, you know, a job seekers exemption certificate is a nice policy proposal. And the GNU has not really suggested getting close to doing anything like that. But then I think about, you know, well, what would happen if there was no party that is not ideologically aligned to the ANC in terms of its leftist ideology in the room for decision making? You would say that, you know, these decisions are still being made. I say, yeah, but like at a much more maybe slower rate, slower pace. Like I don't think anyone will say that things cannot get worse, and that mere fact that things can get worse means that irrespective of what the GNU achieves or doesn't achieve, it is good because it is not that horrible situation.
Yeah, our head of operations, Gail Day, just took a 6-week cycle tour through Cuba, and the first thing she said when she got back was, "Things can get worse." Not being able to find aspirin in the pharmacy, for example. So yeah, I think we must also be grateful for our freedoms and defend them vigorously. Monet, you wanted to respond?
Well, yes, actually, what you just said has reminded me of that the debate between the optimist and the realist when it comes to policy analysis. And the one guy says, geez, it can't get any worse than this. The other guy says, well, that's pretty optimistic. I think it can get a lot worse. Actually, David, I think I'm just going to turn the tables on you a bit and ask a question to you, because Martin and Zakes have both sort of been proposing two different ideas, and there's this debate around, to what extent is what we have desirable, and to what extent is it better than any realistic alternative. And I think instead of getting bogged down necessarily in particular details, if we just zoom out and we just look at some of the macro figures, if I told you in January 2024 that by the end of the election or after the election, what were your main concerns in January? And if I told you that after the election we're not going to have a single day of load shedding, inflation, which was at that point quite high, is going to be lower. Interest rates will start coming down. The rand will start strengthening versus the dollar, and yeah, various other things that I think you could point out which don't come to mind. Interest rates. If I told you that's going to happen, what would you have thought would happen in the election? And if I told you that that's subject to a GNU, would you have taken the deal?
Gosh, you put me on the spot here, Monet. So all of those things are good, and I think reflects a shifting balance of power in South Africa. But that is a huge opportunity to really end the ANC's hegemonic grip on South Africa. And there may have been strategic reasons to enter the GNU to enforce that balance of power. But I think Martin's point is quite persuasive for me, which is around the lack of preconditions. And I think if we take a step back from the negotiation strategy and process, obviously we're somewhat sympathetic to the very tight timeframes that were imposed. They had 2 weeks to negotiate, whereas you compare to CODESA, that was years of negotiations. And compared to Germany, where they take months to negotiate a coalition. But I think there must be a premise underlying the negotiations that of reasonable or proportional respect, and then also a sense of what are those red lines. And a red line is only a red line if you're prepared to sacrifice the agreement if that is breached. So I think maybe there were persuasive arguments for a GNU, and I think the alternative of an EFF and an MK coalition government is genuinely concerning for people who favor liberty, such as ourselves. But that argument, you're conceding that you will basically tolerate almost any terms in order to stay into the GNU, because the ANC can always say, well, if you don't like the Bella Bill, then why don't you leave and we'll go and join EFF and MK. So you lose that bargaining advantage, which I think is so important. I think whatever the former opposition parties think, they need to, or whatever approach they take, they need to ensure maximum leverage. So if you're in the GNU and you're the Minister of Communications, you should privatize the SABC. And the Minister of Communications could also wield a sledgehammer on the post office. And if the Minister of Health, the ANC minister, is going to press ahead unilaterally with NHI, then the Minister of Infrastructure must unilaterally press ahead with privatizing access to infrastructure build projects. So, I think We need a lot more Machiavellian ministers in the GNU, a lot more brinkmanship, and rather than consensus seeking and, this is a kumbaya rainbow nation moment where we're all coming together, because otherwise you're going to get taken advantage of. Zakes, you wanted to come in there, and we must also reflect on some of our policy prescriptions as well.
Cool. But just quickly on what you just said, right? Because I find it interesting. I don't necessarily think that there's any difference between political parties acceding outside of the GNU and political parties existing inside the GNU and still having policies that they would ideologically not present to their base passing, right? Like the NHI as a policy, just using the NHI as an example, it was proposed when the ANC still had a majority, passed theoretically when the ANC still had a majority. I don't think that if the DA or the Freedom Fund Plus is not in the GNU, the Minister of Health or Cyril Ramaphosa does not sign Bella into law. I don't think that happens. Instead, I think that it is much more easier for Cyril Ramaphosa to sign Bella into law when the DA and the Freedom Fund Plus aren't in the decision-making room, for them to be able to be like, okay, no, maybe accede on these, provisions a bit. I don't think that that's a possibility, because that did happen. Of course, he did walk back the actual, staying of implementation of certain provisions, but that is not even a possibility without those parties being in the room. And when they're outside of the room, the thing just gets passed. And of course, the counterpoint is that it still gets passed either way. But I'm saying like that minute difference, that voice within, that has to make a difference. Because if we are gonna accept that, they're gonna do this thing whether we're here or not, I think that it is better when you are there and you can tell them, maybe don't do that. Maybe that is stupid. But
so, thank you for your input.
Yes,
now we're going to go ahead
and then of course, for instance, if there's a new law, just like this new text, right, it will have to be a money bill because it's a new text that's being proposed. The ANC does not have a 40% majority. Theoretically, the DA and every other party that's in the GNU that disagrees with this cannot vote for them in parliament, vote with them in parliament. But other parties, even if they aren't in a formal coalition, right, they believe in this thing. MK, I know for sure, believes in the transformation fund. The AFF believes in the transformation fund. They would not be in a coalition, but they would still vote for it. The DA can leave the coalition due to the transformation fund. That would be great in terms of optics. I'm sure for them, they'll feel good about it.
But do they actually exercise that veto right? I think that is the question.
I'm saying that they can exercise the veto right, they can leave, right? Hypothetically, let's say they do, because I don't think that it's consequential whether they actually exercise it or not. I think that the main point is I find it is better for them that they are there, even though they will get run over. It presents a much more better solution that they are there to begin with, because that means that the Minister of Education can not show up to the signing of the Bella bill. Of course, it means nothing. But it shows her dissatisfaction. Should a new law come into play in parliament, they can choose not to vote for that. So I am really not into the idea that the ANC just being left to their own devices without all these parties is the greatest of ideas. I'm sure no one here is saying that, but I'm saying we have to be willing to admit that it can get worse, and the GNU is the demo from it getting worse. Irrespective of whether the demo has holes and we think it's a bit rickety, we can acknowledge that if we remove it entirely, we will be flooded. So that's my point.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure if I'd go damn wall, but I do think that you have to. Okay, it's a bad metaphor. It might be a metaphor, but that does make it good. No, I think that actually I disagree with Zakes on one thing, and that's that I don't think it's necessarily better for the DA as a party or better for any of the GNU parties to be a part of the coalition in and of itself. I think that they've actually placed themselves in the hot seat. I think it's actually you're in a better position if you're in the EFF or the MK, because I don't think those parties are interested in governing. And I think you see that in the provincial level as well. When there is a provincial coalition and the EFF is part of it, even if it does have a far higher percentage of the vote, they'd still rather have someone from Action SA or someone from Al Jamar take the position of mayor or take the executive position. That's because I think that they've worked out through their time as part of the ANC that it's far more fun to be the opposition than it is to be the actual policymakers and the ones that have to govern. Where I do think Zakes is right is that I think the presence of those parties does turn up the heat on those parties. In the past, you might have felt despondent about the fact that those opposition parties can't really exercise any meaningful influence over policy. Might be overstated in any case, but I think now they're being confronted with the fact that it's not despondency, it's indignancy. People are absolutely livid because now they voted for a party, that party is in government. So whereas in the past they would have simply accepted the fact that as an opposition party you can only do so much, now there's a heightened expectation on those parties. So I do think it places additional pressure on them, which means that them acting in their own self-interest, because politicians are human beings like the rest of us. Well, maybe not like the rest of us, but they are human beings. But I do think we are better off for having them there as opposed to not having them there at all. I don't really think there's much of a risk of an EFF or MK coalition because, like I said, I don't think they're really interested in governing. But I do think that it's better than at least the status quo ante before the election.
Yeah, and we started this conversation by speaking about Jacob Zuma, and he's arguably one of the most powerful politicians in South Africa, and he doesn't hold office. And you could probably say that he's more powerful than a lot of the cabinet ministers who, are there in an official capacity. Martin, did you want to maybe elaborate on some of the devolution points? Because, if you think about trying to extract advantages, particularly the DA in the Western Cape, if the GNU had to collapse tomorrow, would they come away with more powers for the provinces and the cities that they run?
Yeah, I think that's important thing. So before the election, we had our campaign for Home Rule Roadshow to the Western Cape. Now, this is before we knew about the kind of kumbaya moment that was quickly approaching us. But I think what we pointed to there was that even after governing these jurisdictions for decades sometimes, even to the extent that they are constitutionally permitted to kind of take more powers for themselves, the opposition hasn't. And I think one of the exciting parts of the GNU was that, well, now you're in the same room and now you don't have to take it. You can just kind of, you're now colleagues, so you're going to get it. That also did not happen. So clearly, I think from our perspective, we're back at the kind of take power into your own hands perspective, in that if you have a problem in your jurisdiction, in your municipality, in your province, you just have to solve it. We were assured that the Western Cape cannot establish its own police force. We were told this over and over again, and then Panyaza Lesufi, Premier of Gauteng, established his own police force. So it's like it's that Machiavellian thing that you alluded to earlier, whereby certain parties are just willing to, they have their ideology and they're going to do what needs to be done to achieve that, and other parties, certainly they're all ideological in their own in their own respect, but they're certainly not willing to take those steps, and that's kind of the thing that holds up devolution and decentralization of power. But just if I can just take a small step back, I think there's a few points to elaborate on just on our little debate here. Firstly, a lot of people are trying to tell us, and I think we all are kind of in agreement here about how bad it really can get in the world. This is kind of our job is to understand what works and what hasn't, and we understand the Soviet Union quite intimately well, and Venezuela and Zimbabwe. And suddenly now a lot of people who we've told this story to before are trying to convince us, hey, listen, it can get a lot worse in South Africa. And it's like, well, yes, we told you so. So no need to remind us. So I think that's the first point. Of course, it can get worse. EFF and MK in government is absolutely disastrous. And that's why just before the election, my column was, yes, you can vote wrong. There is the idea that any vote is a legitimate vote is a very pernicious idea. You can certainly vote wrong, and that could kill your whole society, if not your whole civilization. And that's certainly the case when it comes to parties like the EFF and MK. So absolutely, that is clear. But just 2 points here. Now, the first thing is, what is the value of a political opposition? Now, I know there's a lot of symbolism associated with it, but it is important. Because I think the idea that just the presence of sensible people in government, that is solved by Lenin's democratic centralism. That is Soviet Union, communist China. It's like we get the experts, they're in the ANC, they're in the Politburo. So the sensible people are around, they're going to say the good thing, we're going to overrule them, and good, we had a nice hefty debate about it, but we're going to thunder ahead anyway. I think, of course, it's good to have sensible people around. The issue is, and this is something that I must say with all due respect, of course, I know many of the people now who are in the GNU, and I've known some of them for many years. This is not me attacking their characters, but we have to see the receipts. What David often points to is that before the GNU, we had parliamentary debates where the ANC has their thing and the DA says, no, that's a bad idea for this. The Freedom Front says, bad idea for this reason. Now we almost have a consociational system, something that the National Party at some point flirted with, whereby it's governance by the elites. You take all the kind of blocks in society, you see their elites, and you all retreat into the cabinet room. And there the wrangling happens, and then one guy exits, the spokesperson comes out of cabinet and says, this is what we agreed on. And now we are supposed to accept, as an article of faith, that in fact the sensible people are putting forward the liberal ideas that we've identified in our Liberty First papers about what you have to deregulate, how you have to liberalize, you have to respect private property rights. We are being told that this is being said. Now, I appreciate that. But unfortunately, I would be an absolutely horrendous policy analyst if I just said, well, okay, if you say so, sir. We have to see the receipts. And then I am willing, certainly speaking for myself, I am then willing to if they say this is where we put it to the minister, that he is flirting with disaster. We said it, here's the minutes underlined. Minister, you are an idiot. You are going to destroy the country. And they were overruled. I am willing to accept that, and I'm willing to respect that. What I'm not willing to respect is the rhetoric of camaraderie, the rhetoric of friendship, the rhetoric of absolute and unqualified concessions, and just this almost casual appeal to, well, we put good ideas to them and they said no. I want the receipts. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think this is a good opportunity for us to turn to the audience, who I'm sure have lots of questions for us.
Just one last thing about the receipts, because there are receipts there, though. Like the Minister of Education, there are receipts. She opposed the Bella Bill.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
But you said you'll concede, though. Okay, great, everyone. So the GNU works. It works.
So I think everyone is getting an insight into what the average day at the Free Market Foundation looks like, where we basically argue incessantly with one another.
Democratic centralism doesn't apply in the free market.
Yeah, and if I could just ask you to please use the microphone for the benefit of our audience back home. I see a question over here from our friend Mark Oppenheim.
So I think you're right to point out that the political parties are acting in particular interests, and it's often not going to be in South Africa's interest. There's a delusion that many people have, which is that everybody has some good idea that is for the benefit of all people, and that's just not the case. Like, the ANC are largely a cancerous, sinister organization, and at least they're being diluted. But they are going to try and achieve their sinister ends, and they are going to try and overrun the liberal will. And you pointed out one of the reasons why it's so hard for the DA to get what they want, which is that the ANC can say, well, we always have these other friends over here in the corner. And that notion that the ANC would get in bed with the MK and with the EFF should be decried as often as possible. It should be put to the ANC, those people are evil, you know they will ruin the country. You should, without a doubt, say you will never enter into a coalition with them. So you take away that bargaining chip. And I think it's quite important to place pressure on the ANC. As you point out, you've got a balance of forces situation. The ANC respect being hit on the nose very hard. And if the DA aren't willing to do it, then civil society needs to do it. And it needs to be seen as an incredibly unpopular thing to be able to always use that worst case scenario as a foil. People go, well, it could be so much worse. That needs to be taken off the table so you can have a proper negotiation. What I wonder about is that given that the DA have some access to power, what steps do you intend on taking to influence them? That if the negotiating table becomes more open for them, how do you try and get them to implement some of their good ideas? And there are some that are being implemented. I mean, Leon Schreiber is doing a pretty good job in Home Affairs. But you mentioned they've got this terrible idea coming out of the DTI, and there's a deputy minister from the DA in the DTI. That should never have happened. So how do you try and exercise influence on the DA to ensure that liberty comes first?
Well, thanks, Mark, for your excellent question. What I would say categorically is that we are happy to talk with any politician in the GNU. We understand that they have their own interests and incentives, but we have a strong interest in promoting liberty to whoever will listen, whether that's the DA, the IFP, which also has a strong tradition of decentralization and devolution and federalism. Or the Freedom Front Plus or Gayton Mackenzie's Patriotic Alliance. Even if we believe that there shouldn't be a minister of sport at all, we're still happy to speak with someone like Gate. So I think influence and access is one way in which you do that. But as you point out, you need to also place pressure on politicians. So I think if we're not if we're not satisfied with the direction which policy is going, we're going to be quite vocal about that. We're going to express that on public platforms. If that initiates a conversation, then we'd be happy to engage with that in a civil but firm way. And I would just echo Martin's point. I think a lot of politics is now happening inside the black box of the GNU, around a very, very large and growing cabinet table. And if you think about it, about a fifth of all parliamentarians are now in the cabinet, and we're not really privy to what's happening in those discussions. And as you point out, civil society's role here is really essential. And really, I think the big danger is that the civil society goes to sleep, and that we say, okay, well, everything's in hand now. There's this GNU that we're assured is going to make the right decisions. But as you point out, politicians are responding to their own incentives. So I think it's also incumbent upon the constituencies, the voters, who also put these parties into power to say, okay, well, listen, our support is not guaranteed. We need to see certain results. And I think, unfortunately, in South Africa, we have a bit of a disconnect between constituents and the political representatives. That could be a feature of our system, of our political institutions, but also our political culture. And I think part of what we see as our role is making a noise, getting the conversation started, and having the dialogue with people who have a big responsibility in power. Gents, do you want to come in on any of those points, or should we go to the next question?
Just a short point, and then we can go on. It's just that I agree completely regarding the necessity, or at least regarding the fact that it has to be clearly toxic for any party to enter into a coalition with either the EFF or the MK. I think that's more of like a paper tiger kind of threat. There's nothing stopping the ANC from doing that now. They could go into that coalition now. They don't have to wait for the DA to exercise any authority for them to do that. The reason why they're not doing it is because neither of those two parties really want to do it. But on the other hand, I think what we also have to do is, because I don't think the main risk is necessarily the accelerating decline one, or the very, very fast accelerating decline. I think the biggest risk we're at now is a sort of inertia. And I think that you also, when you do have to exercise quite a bit of pressure, is to make sure that that the fundamental premise which has governed politics in South Africa, which is this notion that society, that the economy has to be managed. There has to be a state-led management of society, a state-led management of the economy, and it has to be clear that those ideas, especially insofar as they are expressed in policy, are also toxic, and that not only our expectations are not only that you'll keep one toxic option off the table, but also that you'll keep the existing, and I think the even more threatening policy stance off the table as well, because I think that, and I can't quite remember who alluded to this, I think it might have been Martin, the notion that you have the ANC as a very strong governing ideology, whereas I think that pretty much every non-ANC party in the GNU has almost a sort of we take our ideology seriously but not literally kind of approach to ideology. You know, we're very serious about it, but not literally serious about it. So, I mean, don't force us to actually implement anything that moves away from this. And I think it has to be not just a better decision maker, but someone who is willing to actually devolve that decision to South Africans themselves, because we're tired of being infantilized.
Okay.
I would just like to
see there are other hands.
Yeah. I just want to briefly add to what Mark said, and I think very quickly the fallacy of mere access to power is something that we need to be very careful about. Obviously, all of business is opposed to EWC. I cannot imagine that there is one businessman in South Africa who said, hey, let's get this. Yet, this is still something that is policy in South Africa. The EWC bill has been adopted, just needs to be signed by the president. So mere access is useless. And I say this as a policy analyst. You have to create power. And this is why when Solidarity and AfriForum say something, the DA, the Freedom Front, and the former opposition parties take notice. On the ANC side of things, when the taxi industry says something, when the trade union says something, the ANC takes notice, the EFF takes notice, MK takes notice. You have to build power. That's the only way you can influence whatever your preferred political party is. And that's why the model is set by the Solidarity movement and then groups like Sakeliga. And I think increasingly the Free Market Foundation is also thinking in those terms, is that just having the minister on speed dial, it's actually meaningless. Do not be tempted into thinking that mere access is going to win you any victories. You have to build power, and then you have to have leverage.
No, I want to come from a slightly different angle. I think that if you push it, we have got quite a few successes in South Africa. We can also, of course, refer to successes around the world, and there are millions and millions of those. Singapore, Hong Kong. So there are successes, but I'd like to just mention that there are a number of successes in South Africa that I think we should always refer to. The airline industry, we're talking about privatizing SAA. De facto, SAA has been privatized. It was the airline industry was deregulated in the early 90s. It then had something like 90% of the industry. It now has, I don't know, 5 or 10%. And I think we must mention that. We mustn't just say we want to privatize SAA. We say we have privatized, get rid of, we've gone from 90 down to 5, let's get rid of the other 5. And I think that will be much more beneficial. Energy, I believe that the deregulation that happened here is probably as big a deregulation as anywhere in the world. We need to spell that out. There was a story of 1 megabyte, then going to 10 megabytes, and then 100 megawatts. And now there is no limit whatsoever. It's an open question as to whether the success of no load shedding is due to that or a bit of Eskom improving. So I suspect it's both. We also have Telkom, which was privatized. And so these are the things that we can talk about at the state level. At the provincial level, I think we should emphasize, well, both provincial and state, the health industry. We keep going on about the national health industry. We mustn't do that. But there's a lot of private sector health stories that we're going, as we've discussed before. Education, the same thing. All the private schools are privatized. Let's speak about those. And if you want to, the roads, the national roads are toll roads, and they're not privately owned, but they're privately managed. So, and lastly, let's go down to the to the local municipal level. We've got one of the biggest privatizations again in the world. We are privatizing housing. There's something like another 1 million to privatize, but we've done many hundreds, tens of thousands, as you know. And that's government policy, by the way, to sell those houses or give them away. And then go right the way down on to the local municipalities. For example, a silly example, but important. George now has private sector doing its grassing. There are lots and lots of those. And I think that you need to say, let's carry on and do more and more of those. These guys don't understand, I'm sorry. My experience with municipalities, with politicians, they cannot go from an abstract down to a specific. So I think we've got to give them the specifics as well.
Yeah. Very nice contribution. Thanks.
Yes, I almost thought you were not going to mention it, Terry. For those of you who aren't aware, Terry works in the Kaya Lam project, which is affiliated to the FMF, and actually, to speak very broadly about it, it entails registering title deeds onto the names of the tenants of the former RDP housing primarily. And just linking that up, not only is that a huge victory in and of itself, I think it's over 20,000 title deeds that have been registered. Close to 20, yeah. Close to 20,000 title deeds that have been registered to date. And just to link that up to Martin's point, that's 17,000 people who also have an interest in property rights. That's 17,000 people who now have their own title deed, who have a home registered on their name. And that's also how you build power. That's also how you build influence. And above and beyond that, it's just a very good thing to have more people owning the homes in which they live.
But I think Terry's point is a good one. We need to make the positive story for liberty, not just rightly caution against infringements on liberty, but to say actually this stuff works. And I mean, I think also pointing to the successes in other countries like Argentina, for example, where they're cutting aggressively back on state spending. This actually makes a meaningful impact on people's lives. All right, should we go to another question? Hugh. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if you could just speak into the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Done. It is working. I thought I'd just remind us here of a very important thing, that at the end of apartheid in this country, and we adopted a constitution, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, where Parliament could do more or less what it liked, provided it complied with formalities in passing that pernicious legislation that I'm referring to. It could do what it liked under parliamentary sovereignty, and we've now moved to constitutional supremacy. Those of you, and there's some eminent lawyers here, will know what that means. Now, as I understand it, the MK and the EFF would like to reverse that again. God forbid. I want to just leave that thought with you. That is so fundamental that we go back to that sort of P.W. Botha dictatorial stuff, where under sovereignty of Parliament you can do that. The other thought that I thought I'd just leave is, are we not perhaps moving back in a sense to the division between verligters and verkrampters, and perhaps reformists and non-reformists? And I just wonder, listening to the rhetoric and hearing you talk about so many people gathered in this GNU, they must be sharing ideas and what have you. And I wonder whether we're not seeing, and we will see with growing strength, this divide between, let's call it the verligters and the verkrampters, or the reformists and the non-reformists. And then lastly, if I heard you correctly, and I may not have heard you correctly, was it suggested that the post office should be shut down? Because if that was suggested, I'm just wondering about all those people out, perhaps mainly in the country, who don't have access to computers, laptops, and what have you, as we do, and their need for the post office. I still have a post office box and get various things in it from overseas and charities and what have you. Thank you.
Yeah, just to pick up on the post office thing. I mean, we're radical liberals here, so we would say shut them all down. But I mean, there are less bad things that you can do. And the reality is the institution of the state has no business in taking a parcel from A to B. But if the state feels that that's an important thing, it can subsidize it. So get the corrupt cadres out and appoint courier guy to run the former post office or something. Just, it's corrupt and everything, but it's a far cry better than having the state run it directly. So yeah.
My understanding, and I've had this discussion with him because I used to work with him, deal with him, and whatever, is that he asked no less than the president of this country to leave the post bank in the post office. Without it, he couldn't make it work, and he was told that that was not on. I'll share that, and I think Mark would, if possible, he would tell that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I also follow Mr. Barnes on social media, so I think he's a great guy, sensible man, but he hasn't quite, like Mr. Derator, he never quite arrived at what the answer is to the whole thing, and that is really to get the state out of it, because it's the state's hand that taints the post bank failing, that taints the RAF failing, that taints ESCOM failing, and so on. The state's hand is never a solution, it's always a problem. And then just on your parliamentary sovereignty point, again, you can vote wrong. So always bear that in mind when you vote for a party that wants parliamentary sovereignty.
So, Mike Sham from State of the Nation is here tonight. So I'm sure he has an interesting insight.
Just a question. On? Hello? Okay, good. Just a question on the analysis. You mentioned that there are, worse things than the GNU. You mentioned a whole lot of people that might know that there's worse things than the GNU. But the people that know that the best are the ANC. That's why they rushed into it. Right? They didn't do it out of altruism or anything else. They did it because, bear in mind, South Africa was run by a coalition of ANC, MK, and EFF until 10 years ago. So those people left in the ANC understand what it's like to be in coalition with Zuma and Malema. That's why they ran a mile from it. Why is your analysis based on the fact that ANC are almost sort of like, damsel in distress? They could go one way or another. We're talking about ultra-capitalists here. We talk about guys that live a more capitalist life than you and I do, right? They are committed to stealing money. They have the finest consumer goods, holiday overseas, etc. They understand that should they go across to the dark side, the economy collapses and their capitalist life disappears. Their kids aren't at government schools, they're not going to government hospitals. So, this sort of gutless idea that that the other parties in the GNU are sitting there trying to save this damsel in distress from herself. No, they understand it a lot better than people, in this room. They steal this money all the time. They know that if the money doesn't come in, they know if the rand goes to 100 to the dollar, that it's them that pay. And they, everybody at the end works in their own personal interest. Yes, there are one or two nut jobs amongst them, Motswaledi and a few others. But the rump understand that if you want to keep the spigots open of cash, do the deal. And the only people that don't seem to understand it are the DA, that have got enormous leverage, but they're acting like God knows what, little lapdogs. But the point is that why in your analysis did you not mention that the ANC are the people that want this GNU more than anybody else?
Can I take the question? Because I find it to be extremely interesting, right? And nice to see you again, Mike. The idea that the people who suffer when things go bad in an economy or in a country are the people who in political positions is simply not true. In leadership positions in the ANC, the ones who are stealing money, of course, right? If you're stealing money, you're in a position to do so. But that is not true. Like, we can look at ZANU-PF just next door in Zimbabwe. They've completely destroyed the Zimbabwean economy. The average Zimbabwean cannot sustain themselves, yet the average ZANU-PF crony is living quite comfortably. Like, I'm sure if you were to look at, the figures for Mercedes, there are still Mercedes Benzes being sold in Zimbabwe, even though they experience hyperinflation. So this idea that a politician is gonna destroy something, particularly a socialist, particularly one ideologically committed to the idea that the state should be involved in everything, is gonna stop themselves, is truly divorced from reality. Every socialist country has never went away from socialists because the leaders were like, you know what? Money is running out. No, the money never runs out for them. The money just runs out for everyone, and you end up eating your family members. You will get to that point, as they did in the Holodomor in Ukraine, before Stalin is like, you know what, maybe I've eaten enough of this person's, produce. So I don't think that, there is a point whereby someone who's like a politician, who's ideologically committed, or just any person who's self-interest, and they're in a position whereby they can extract resources without necessarily producing them, will come to a point where it'll be like, I've extracted enough. That doesn't happen. Instead, it's the people who are being oppressed who actually be like, yeah, no, that's enough. And then they'll be like, okay, maybe I've, kind of pushed it that much. And the idea, right, that, the ANC then won't go to the EFF and the MK is an idea also that I think a lot of people are divorced from reality. The MK and EFF don't need to be in a coalition with the ANC. Let's take the current transformation bill. There's no GNU and a money bill is proposed in parliament and the ANC, introduces the bill. As I said, ideologically, this is something that the MK and the EFF, their constituents, right? The people who vote for them, who make up their branches, agree with. So they don't need to be in a coalition with the ANC. The media just needs to say there's a bill that's, will create a transformation fund, and best believe there will be pressure from the constituents of MK and the EFF to vote for that bill. So whether whether they agree with the ANC about maybe fiscal policy or not is inconsequential about that thing. And we miss that because, well, they don't have that option of going to these people when the GNU, of course, they do have that option, but that option is belayed by the fact that there are people in the room telling them maybe this is not such a great idea. So I don't think that, the idea, sorry, I'm so sorry. I don't think that the idea of having sensible people in the room is necessarily a bad thing. And also, things can get worse. It isn't necessarily a gutless thing to say that the ANC can go to the EFF and MK. Instead, the point that they were once unified in the past is the point that supports that they can unify again. I don't think it means that they will never, work together again. Instead, it supports the idea that should the opportunity arise, they can agree on an issue by issue basis. And I think that possibility of an issue by issue basis agreement between these parties who agree largely ideologically is delayed by the fact that there are other parties who are associated with one of these parties who are like, yeah, no, maybe we should not be doing that. And I think that there's value in that. I generally think that, I get the argument from people in the DAO and the Freedom Fund Plus who are like, we are legit saving you from destruction. It may be a bit self-aggrandizing, but if you actually sit down and think about it, they kind of are saving us from destruction. And that should be appreciated. I think we can appreciate that things can get worse, and without also going to the extreme of like, oh no, we can just let things be and it'll all work out. These guys are sensible. Like, no. Prior to the GNU, these guys were destroying the economy, continuing to destroy the economy whilst eating. Nothing was stopping them. They wanted NHI on top of the destruction that they did. So I don't think that, if the GNU was not there, they would somehow have came to their senses. But that's just me, of course.
We're going to take one last question, and then we're going to wrap up.
So none of this really surprises me, because if you think about the school of politics, I think the ANC people were much better prepared for brinkmanship, intimidatory tactics, and underhand tactics than the DA. I mean, the ANC is a pretty good school of those kind of behaviors. So it doesn't surprise me that they outplay the DA ministers. They, what's that survivor? Outplay, outsmart, and outlast. I think they come on top, come out on top in survivor Politics SA. And the question I wanted to really ask is on the outlast part, because you know, the GNU is not going to be around forever. And I just wanted you guys to explore the hypothetical scenario of the ANC outlasting the GNU and what that future could look like.
Yeah, you know, one scenario is that actually MK withers on the vine because maybe Jacob Zuma shuffles off his mortal coil and the party collapses, or there's some leadership internal issues within the EFF, and the electorate doesn't reward the DA in the way that it thinks at the next elections, because they don't see necessarily the significant policy changes or implementation changes. And then we have a return back to ANC dominance, or an ANC at, say, 48% cobbling together another coalition with the Good Party and Al Jamaah or something like that. In which case we will see a continuation of the policy status quo. And so what my takeaway is, I think, building on Mornay's comment, that let's try and get away from this idea that the state is the guiding actor in society and that we need to compete over the access to that. And let's build power outside of the state, which is really, I think, a philosophy that underpins a lot of our work and which flows through this document. It's around state-proofing yourself, building capacity at a individual but also community level as well. And I think South Africa could really be a pathbreaker in that regard, but really starting to pull away and move away from that concentration risk in terms of government policy. But at the same time, you have to build barricades as well against hostile policy. Well, gentlemen, I wanted to thank you very much for your contributions, but also to thank the audience for being here today and for such lively engagement as well. We really appreciate that. And as a final takeaway, I'd encourage you to go to the website for the Liberty First policy agenda, libertyfirst.co.za. You can access that through the Free Market Foundation website as well. We have videos as well as the links to the original reports where we did press briefings on each of these reports. So if you want to delve deep into some of our policy prescriptions, you can do that through there. But this is not the end of the conversation. We'll be taking it outside over a drink and some snacks, so please do join us there. If you're watching on social media, please do leave a comment and a like as well. That really helps with the algorithm. And thanks for joining us there as well. But until next time, stay free.